And welcome and good morning to everybody. I have two questions for you in the chat. I'm going to launch those questions right now and then say a few things before we get into the official part of the program this morning. I'm a fourth generation teacher. I am one of those people that believes teaching is a noble profession. I could list all my family members that are also teachers like myself, but it would take most of the morning to do so. But I think about them all the time when I'm doing presentations like this. Some of them teach in the same context in which you all teach, as well. They teach in public schools. For example, back in Illinois, they teach in high school and middle school. They're ESL teachers. My mom was an adult education GED teacher as well, taught a little bit at community colleges. So within my family, we have like most of these, sort of educational venues covered by all the teachers. So when I'm invited by Humanities Texas to do something like this, I'm genuinely, sincerely excited about doing it. So I see a rose for Emily, actually, as one of the votes for favorite story, Death by Scrabble. Okay, great, thank you. Continue, please, to drop your answers to the question there in the chat. I do see Cathedral, Raymond Carver as well. I'm recognizing a lot of these stories. That's fun too. So, okay, so for today, we've decided to break the webinar into two pretty distinct units. In the first one, I'm just going to talk a little bit about approaches to teaching the short story. I've taught short stories in most of my classes for 25 years. So what you're seeing is a product of my attempt to try all kinds of different things to keep our students interested in short fiction. And of course, I'm focusing on the things that I feel have worked the best over the longest amount of time. So that we'll do that in the first part of the webinar, and we'll take a short break, give everybody a chance to fill up on their coffee. Hopefully Meredith's coffee will be ready by then. And then we'll come back and we'll talk more specifically about the three short stories that were uploaded to Google Classroom, I believe, too. So Masque of the Red Death. We're going to talk about Poe just briefly when we get into the presentation. So, all right, thank you all. Man, you represent the entire state here. That's great. And someone from Corpus Christi, too, the yellow wallpaper. Excellent. That will also make an appearance in my presentation. So, okay, I'm going to share my screen. Make sure that... and wait to make sure that you're able to see this. I'll wait just a second. Laura, Elizabeth, it looks good? Okay, all right. Okay, excellent. So in this view, I'm not able to see the chat. So Laura or Elizabeth, if someone does have a question, if you could alert me, that would be great, or a comment, or maybe I'll pause here and there, as well, just to make sure that we're still on the same page. So, okay, here we go. So one of the first things that I like to do, really in any literature class, is to talk about the significance and value of literature. That is, I try to take the big picture. I don't want to proceed on the assumption that all the students are there because they really love literature. That would be a mistake. They're required to be there in many cases. For example, I teach one of the core requirements at UT, an Introduction to American Literature class. It often has 300 or 400 students in it, and the large majority of them are from outside of the liberal arts and humanities, and they're there because it's a requirement. And so in any case, One of the things I like to do is just to take a really big picture perspective on literature. And one author who's very helpful with this is Jonathan Gottschall. He wrote a book, it's about 10 years old now, called How Stories Make Us Human. And here's what he says in one section of that book. He says, "Story, sacred and profane, is perhaps the main cohering force in human life. A society is composed of fractious people with different personalities, goals, and agendas. What connects us beyond our kinship ties? Story. As John Gardner puts it, fiction is essentially serious and beneficial, a game played against chaos and death, against entropy. Story is the counterforce to social disorder, the tendency of things to fall apart. Story is the center without which the rest cannot hold." And so I share this passage with the students on the first day of class, usually. And then we follow this link, which we don't have time to do this morning, but I think you'll have access to the slideshow, so you'll be able to follow the link yourself and see what's at the other end of it. It's about a 1.5 minute animated video made in the early 40s by two psychologists, Heider and Simmel, and they used it to illustrate their belief that the human brain is hardwired for narrative. And so they showed this animated video to the people doing the experiment and asked them what they thought. And 90% of the respondents saw a story, even though the animated video is just a couple shapes moving around the screen, right? But they saw an adventure story, and all kinds of other things. And so this is an experiment that's very easy to do with your students. It doesn't take very much time. They get, in my experience at least, pretty excited about it, particularly, after you get 6 or 7 or 8 of them to share what it is that they saw, and it's so different, right? That they see all kinds of different stories, and certainly patterns start to emerge as well. I also sometimes will share this observation about stories by Neil Gaiman, thinking that perhaps they will recognize Neil Gaiman's name. I hope that's not too optimistic, but he says in the introduction to the 60th anniversary edition of Fahrenheit 451, which I believe still gets taught in high schools. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. I actually can't see anyone's response, but I'm just going to assume the answer to that question is yes. This is what Neil Gaiman says. "Ideas, written ideas, are special. They are the way we transmit our stories and our thoughts from one generation to the next." And that's a passage in particular I'm going to focus on again with the next slide. Stories and our thoughts from one generation to the next. If we lost them, we lose our shared history. We lose much of what makes us human. And fiction gives us empathy. It puts us inside the minds of other people, gives the gift of seeing the world through their eyes. Fiction is a lie that tells us true things over and over. And so here's an activity then that I see as pretty directly related to what Jonathan Gottschall is talking about the importance of stories in everybody's life, and what Neil Gaiman is talking about as well, about stories being a particular kind of inheritance that we don't want interrupted, because it tells us who we are in the world and who we are in relation to other people. And so this is also an activity that I've done with my students, generally in an introduction to literature class. So that is mostly, these would be students who are in their first year at UT. So they're just out of, for the most part, just out of high school. They're 18, 19 years old. And so I asked them to think about family stories. The ones in particular that they hear around the dinner table or around the barbecue pit or wherever, especially during large gatherings on weekends or holidays. When I used to teach summer courses, we'd use the 4th of July, as the source. And then I'll ask them to choose a story that they have heard repeatedly, since we all have examples of this. One of those stories that it's guaranteed someone's going to tell when everyone gets together, and then to each share it either in written or oral form. So if it's a day where you want your students to work on their writing, you could have them write it. If they're working on oral communication, you can have them tell the story as a kind of oral event. And then I asked students to turn their literary critical eye on their own family stories too. Have them discuss the main elements of their stories. Who's the narrator? There are all kinds of questions here. I mean, there are hundreds of questions. I really condensed this, right? But who is the narrator, and what position do they have in the family? And when this narrator speaks, do people believe them? Is this narrator prone to exaggeration? Is this narrator, right, et cetera? All those kinds of questions. What's the setting? Who are the characters? What is the plot, the action, the complication, or the conflict? And then you might also ask students if they changed any element of the stories in their own telling, and if so, why? That can also be really interesting, but that kind of question gets to what storytellers and more specifically writers are doing when they're deciding what to convey in their story. They're making choices not only about what to include, but what to exclude as well. And they've done it themselves, even if they weren't necessarily self-aware of it. And then if you have time, you could ask students to identify any similarities between the stories. And this is a way to get them thinking about conventions, as well, because generally what will happen is, they'll be able to start to group the stories, into particular categories, and, they'll be able to point to similarities between them that suggest there are particular genres of family stories. Even though I can't see the chat, I think it actually would be kind of fun for you all if you could just, like, if you have one of these in mind, just to drop it into the chat in kind of summary or paraphrased form, so you all can glance at that as we kind of move on. I'll share the one that just came to my mind in a very short form, but my dad, who was born in 1936, so he'll be 87 in a couple of months. He cannot help but tell the story about the time that his parents bought him and his older sister boxing gloves for Christmas, and his older sister promptly put one on and broke his nose. And it's just, there's something about that conveys my dad's sense of his place in the family, right? Conveys some sense of the sibling rivalry he had with his older sister. But that happened when he was 6 or 7, so it happened 80 years ago, and he still remembers it. And I feel like that's a really good example of the way that the stories that we hear and the stories that we tell us so much about who we are. But figuring that all out also requires analysis, as well. Let me take a moment, actually. Now that we're here, that's I think of that's the big picture, right? So that's the sort of the big picture introduction. So I want to pause for just a second, and I'll ask Laura and Elizabeth if you're seeing anything in the chat to which I could respond, or any questions or comments.
Not yet.
Okay.
Some people are dropping stories now.
Good. Okay. All right. Please keep doing that. Okay. So Elizabeth and Laura did share the TEKS requirements with me too, and I read them and pondered them, and I think I settled on this particular section of them as the one that I think most adheres to how I would think about teaching literature and teaching short stories. And so in moving forward, I tried to keep this section of those requirements in mind, thinking about response skills, thinking about asking students to listen, speak, read, and write, and think about multiple texts, to describe personal connections to sources, using textual evidence, paraphrasing, summarizing, all these kinds of things. But I just wanted to be, really upfront about the fact that, I understand that this is important, that it needs to be addressed and maybe negotiated would be a word to use. And so I've tried to keep that in mind, for today's presentation, too. Okay. So that first introductory part, is something, is an approach you can take no matter what you're teaching, right? Whether you're teaching poems or drama or nonfiction. I understand there's a nonfiction webinar coming up a little bit later in the summer too that y'all can keep your eye out for. So that works, no matter what you're doing. So now I'm going to narrow the focus a little bit and talk more specifically about short stories before then getting into the Hemingway, Lahiri, and Casares today. So in teaching short stories, I think it's important to give a definition to your students at the risk of stating the obvious. Though I've also learned after 25 years of teaching that sometimes it's the most obvious thing that I forget to do. And so I'm going to give you a couple different definitions of short stories. One from Edgar Allan Poe. I saw that someone in the room said The Masque of the Red Death was one of their favorite stories. So here's Poe again for you, for everybody actually, but for the person who loves Poe. This is what Poe says. Which almost 180 or more than 180 years ago. I'm sorry, I'm an English professor, not a math. Math is a little challenging, but I think it's 180 years. This is what Poe says. I'll just read the highlighted part, draw your attention to it. Were we called upon, however, to designate that class of composition which, next to such a poem as we have suggested, should best fulfill the demands of high genius, should offer it the most advantageous field of exertion, we should unhesitatingly speak of the prose tale, as Mr. Hawthorne has here exemplified it. We allude to the short prose narrative, requiring from a half hour to 1 or 2 hours in its perusal. So you can see here that Poe is thinking about the short story as a prose narrative that you can read in one sitting, even you might think in one fairly short sitting. The 3 short stories that I chose for you today fulfill that definition, by the way. But he continues in this work that was a published review of a collection of Nathaniel Hawthorne short stories. He says, a skillful literary artist has constructed a tale. If wise, he has not fashioned his thoughts to accommodate his incidents, but having conceived with deliberate care a certain unique or single effect to be wrought out, he then invents such incidents. He then combines such events as may best aid him in establishing this preconceived effect. If his very initial sentence tend not to the outbringing of this effect, then he has failed in his first step. I'm sure I'm not the only person that, as I read that aloud, wondered about Poe's pronouns here. Please insert other pronouns over the exclusively masculine ones that he uses. So he's thinking about a short story as having a certain unique or single effect. That's how he thought of the short stories that he was writing. In fact, I decided at the last minute that I wanted to share with you the first sentence of one of his most famous short stories, not The Masque of the Red Death, but The Fall of the House of Usher, to see if you thought Poe lived up to his own expectations here. So this is the first sentence of The Fall of the House of Usher. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. So again, I can't really see the chat. Any comments on whether you think Poe actually succeeded? In, how does he put it in the previous slide? He says, if his very initial sentence tend not to the outbringing of this effect, then he has failed in his first step. Okay, so according to this, as readers, or in this case, both readers and listeners, since I was reading it out loud, we should all know what effect he's trying to achieve. So I'd actually be really curious to hear what effect you think he was trying to achieve in this first sentence that has dull, dark, soundless, and dreary, all among other things, including the word melancholy. So I think he might be telegraphing the effect he's trying to achieve a little bit. But in any case, you can judge for yourselves. So why don't I, let me do this one too, and then I'll take a brief pause again. So that was a definition of a short story by a short story writer, and actually by an author who was a working and well-respected literary critic in the middle of the 19th century. Here's the definition of a contemporary literary critic who had a very long, decades long, and a prolific career. This is Chris Baldock from the Concise Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms. Short story, a fictional prose tale of no specified length, but too short to be published as a volume on its own. As novellas sometimes and novels usually are, those asterisks are for other entries in his Dictionary of Literary Terms. A short story will normally concentrate on a single event. This is different than Poe's single effect. He's talking about a single event with only one or two characters, more economically than a novel's sustained exploration of social background. There are similar fictional forms of greater antiquity, fables, folktales, and parables. But the short story as we know it flourished in the magazines of the 19th and early 20th centuries, especially in the USA, which has a particularly strong tradition. This is a British scholar, by the way, so he's being complimentary of American literature here. So in any case, so this is a slightly different definition. I think that it can be really helpful for students to see multiple definitions of the genre that you're studying. These are two that you could, of course, share with your students and talk to them about it and talk to them about the differences between them. I also like the fact that Chris Baldock includes fables, folktales, and parables in here and draws a distinction genre-wise between those and short stories. Even though these particular genres are often incorporated into short stories themselves. Before we officially started this morning, I was talking with Laura and Elizabeth about J. Frank Dobie, and he has 3 or 4 books that are full of what look a little bit like short stories, adventure tales, but I think I would categorize them more specifically as Southwestern folklore. A lot of them are about treasure hunting, for example, about, finding gold or silver or something like that, buried in West Texas or buried in the desert in New Mexico or Arizona or northern Mexico. So the genres definitely, as you all know, do bleed together. And even though I said I was going to pause after that slide, I wanted to share this with you as well. This is available in Google Classroom too. Again, it's one of those obvious things that I confess I just sometimes forget to share with students because I get so excited about just teaching the stories themselves that I forget they need a little bit of context. They need a little bit of frame. And also they need a language to talk, a literary critical language to talk about fiction or short fiction, our topic for today as well. So I just this is just the first couple entries on that document. These, we can go back to this in part 2 of the presentation, if you like. These are really straightforward, concise definitions that I find my students really like, particularly the difference between a round and a flat character, for example. Talking about conflict, what conflict means, within the context of a short story, like Ernest Hemingway's Indian Camp, for example. Convention, conventional, exposition as well, the kind of narration that's happening in a story. I've always found that students love foreshadowing almost more than anything. I don't know. It's like something that they learn when they're really young readers and they get so excited about identifying it. Motivation, narration, etc. So you can see the rest of the document in Google Classroom. You're welcome to have it, use it, change it around, do whatever you want with it if you think that it would be helpful for you. So, all right, so I'm going to stop there. In fact, I'm going to stop sharing for just a second, and then I'll come back to this and have a few comments about each one of the authors that I chose to focus on today. So I'm going to stop sharing and then ask, since I haven't been keeping up, Laura and Elizabeth, if there's anything in the chat, any questions in the chat, or if anyone wants to share any comments with the rest of the group before we move on with part 3.
I'll just summarize quickly that we had a number of really great humorous family stories shared in the chat, and then more suggestions or comments on what favorite short stories to teach are. Someone suggested that Stephen King has a really helpful definition for short stories, and then someone also asked about mystery short stories, and that being another genre or subgenre to consider.
Elizabeth, did you say mystery?
Mysteries, yeah.
Mysteries, right? Okay, yeah, very good. Well, I'm sorry I missed the humorous family stories, but maybe does the chat say when you record a Zoom webinar?
We can send you the transcript, don't worry.
Okay, thank you. All right, thanks. That's great. Yeah, I actually like mysteries myself and detective fiction, too. In fact, I have an old collection from the what is this? Let's see, this is from the 40s, Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, right? So this is something that I've just started to read actually too. So yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of my students, I think it's pretty safe to say this, right? So I'm not going to hem and haw about it, right? Our students understand genre fiction, right? They understand fantasy, they understand science fiction. I don't know if they read crime fiction or mysteries very much, but I think that the literary studies as a field has gotten a lot more comfortable, treating all of these genres with a certain kind of respect and critical engagement too. I don't think we have J.K. Rowling entirely to thank for that, but she might have something to do with it, at least a little bit. So yeah, that's great. I mean, I'm of a mind that anything that will get students interested is worth trying. And I think, I think mysteries, and again, murder mysteries, for example. I taught a course with a colleague of mine where I did American crime fiction and he did British crime fiction, and we just went back and forth between the two. If any of you read crime fiction, you know that they're really different, right? I mean, particularly from the golden age of detective fiction, right? From the 30s and from the 20s and the 30s, where this really hard-boiled American crime fiction and, you know, the sort of the murder in the quaint English village kind of murder mystery, right? So in any case, yes. And someone mentioned Stephen King. You know, also there's another mention of Stephen King, Popsy. I don't know what Popsy is. What is that? Is that a King short story?
It's a short story about a vampire.
Okay, fantastic. Great. Thank you. Okay, so I will go back to sharing my screen, say a few things about Hemingway, Lahiri, and Casares, and then we'll be wrapping up part one. Okay. All right. Y'all can see again? Yes? Okay, fantastic. Okay, very good. So Hemingway, I actually think of Hemingway as a pretty easy author to teach, but he presents certain challenges because most people think they know something about him, right? And in some cases, those ideas about him are fairly hardened, you know, by the time a student arrives in your class. I don't know necessarily when this happens. You know, maybe it's actually happening in high school, and then I'm just seeing it, you know, with students in my Introduction to American Literature class. But he is larger than life, of course. And I think one of the things that I tell my students when I'm teaching a Hemingway short story, or teaching an Ernest Hemingway course, so I teach a single author Ernest Hemingway course too, is I tell them to try to forget everything they think they know about Ernest Hemingway, and we're just going to start all over again. You know, so, you know, I'll tell them a little bit about, you know, those things they think they know about him, like you see here, this short biography of him, you know, not being allowed to join the U.S. Army, and volunteering for an ambulance corps, joining the Italian army on that particular front in World War I, and then within a month getting seriously injured. You know, the standard count is that he received 227 wounds. Of course, everybody knows that he fell in love with his nurse, Agnes von Kurowski. He returned to the US. She wrote him a letter and said, "Oh, you're such a sweet young man, but I'm marrying this other guy." Literally, I mean, I'm paraphrasing what she said, right? And so this experience forms the basis of, I think everybody knows, A Farewell to Arms, but he actually wrote a short story version of the experience called A Very Short Story. I don't think it might be his shortest short story now that I think about it. I'd actually have to go back and look and see if it's shorter than A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. But in any case, it's a very short story, right? So when it's published, it takes up 2 pages. But it's actually a good story to teach, because you can talk about Hemingway as a master of the form, and you know, to teach then a story in which he's so self-conscious about the form itself. A Very Short Story is the title of the short story, right? I think presents all kinds of interesting ways for you to talk about short stories. So for Indian Camp, then, and this would be part of the approach that I take when I teach a Hemingway short story. I think it's really important to present to students the context in which Hemingway's short stories are published, because they're experiencing them in a paperback book, right? And in most cases, that's not how they appeared originally. They appeared sometimes in magazines, you know, magazines with really large circulation, right? Hundreds of thousands of subscribers. Sometimes in smaller literary journals. And this is particularly true for In Our Time, which appeared in 4 editions alone, 4 entirely different editions during Ernest Hemingway's lifetime. And so if I'm teaching a story like Indian Camp, I want my students to know the whole story of In Our Time, from where the title comes from, the English Book of Common Prayer, give us peace in our time, O Lord. That's where the title comes from. This can set up a discussion for if you're reading a group of stories in Our Time, about Hemingway's representation of religion and religious belief. It was first published as 6 vignettes in a little tiny literary journal. It was then published a year later, expanded, and it included Hemingway versions of news items. So some of you might remember that he was a journalist throughout his career, actually. I mean, a lot of people say, well, he was a journalist and then he became a literary writer, but he was a published journalist for most of his career, right? Taking jobs with various newspapers to report on things. World War II, for example. And so this is an important detail for thinking about the Hemingway style, which he learned in a newsroom, not in a college classroom. And so when people talk about Hemingway's economy of style, it's pretty easy to connect it to the fact that his first published writings in newspapers had a word limit or a column limit, and he had to be as concise as possible in saying what he wanted to say. And then it came out again a year later. This is in 3 years. This is the 3rd edition. He reused some of it. He rearranged some of it. He added a very short story, the one about his love affair with Agnes von Kurowski that ended so traumatically for poor young Ernest. And then he added Big Two-Hearted River Part 1 and Part 2. These are very frequently anthologized short stories. So maybe some of you have the opportunity to teach them. And then it came out again in 1930. So, okay, now see, I've already lost track of how many this is. It's 4 or 5. Excuse me. So it came out again in Our Time with a new introduction that in subsequent editions was renamed again. So this is the collection then with this history into which Hemingway put a tremendous amount of thought. And then it would go into print and he would change his mind. And it would go into print and he would change his mind. And then it would go into print again. And he'd be like, no, I want to rearrange how this works. But Indian Camp is the opening story in this collection. So it's a really good way to illustrate for your students how thoughtful writers are when it comes to not only choosing the words on the page, but choosing the way you receive them. So Hemingway wrote Big Two-Hearted River 1 and 2 as the conclusion to In Our Time, right? Like that very self-consciously. And he wanted Indian Camp to be the first story, right? This is the introduction to his fictionalized alter ego, Nick Adams. So it's an incredibly important story for Hemingway as a short story writer. And it's also an incredibly important story for just Hemingway as a writer, because it's the first one, right? That people are seeing. So your students probably also know a little bit about the iceberg theory, or they've heard of it. At the risk of spoiling it for students, I direct them to the passage where Hemingway first mentions it. It's in a book about bullfighting. Hemingway saw athletic endeavors as very closely related to writing. He's constantly talking about the similarities between bullfighting and writing, or skiing and writing, or something like that. In his book about bullfighting, Death in the Afternoon, he talks about literature a lot. In his books about being on safari in Africa, he talks about literature a lot. This is what he says about the iceberg theory. If a writer of prose knows enough about what he is writing about, he may omit things that he knows, and the reader, if the writer is writing truly enough, will have a feeling of those things as strongly as though the writer had stated them. The dignity of movement of an iceberg is due to only 1/8 of it being above water. A writer who omits things because he does not know them only makes hollow places in his writing. So this is a passage I'll share it with my students. I don't make them read all of Death in the Afternoon, but I'll share this with them. And then talk about the fact that Hemingway publishes this 10 years after he started writing short stories. So this is, I think the evidence suggests some reverse engineering on Hemingway's part. He did certain things, and then he figured out a way to describe them in hindsight, right? Not that when he was writing Indian Camp, this miracle of compression, as Kenneth S. Lynn says. So when he was writing Indian Camp in November 1923 and finishing it up the following late winter and early spring, he wasn't thinking about icebergs. But about 10 years later, when he was thinking about why he deleted the original opening to the story, he thought about the iceberg theory and said, oh, that's a really good way to describe what it was that I was doing. And we don't need to go through all of this, but we'll talk a little bit more specifically about Indian Camp in the second part of the webinar. But Hemingway deleted 4 or 5 paragraphs from the original manuscript. And in those paragraphs, we get what's happening the night before the story. And what I've highlighted are the things that Hemingway chose to omit, but he would claim are still there in the story that was published. So he deletes Nick feeling uncomfortable and ashamed. And just in case you missed the word ashamed in that sentence, he repeats it in the next one. It's another paragraph talking about his father and uncle going fishing and leaving Nick alone in their camp. And Nick gets frightened. And in case you missed that he was frightened, he tells you that he was a little frightened in the next sentence. And then later, 2 or 3 lines down, Nick's getting afraid. And then we learn what he's afraid about. He's afraid of dying. He realized that someday he must die. And then he reads Robinson Crusoe to distract himself from his fear. But in the end, the fear gets the best of him, and he fires the rifle 3 times to let his dad and uncle know that he wants them back in camp. So that is, that is Hemingway. If you take the iceberg theory, if you look at the original opening of Indian Camp, and then look at the actual published version of Indian Camp, showing your students all of that, again, is a really, I think it's a fun and exciting way to talk about the decisions that writers make. And of course, when it comes to Hemingway, you have a writer who most people think of as being one of the greatest short story writers in English. He was very successful at this and figured out a way to describe it after he had actually figured out the process, right, of omitting these very explicit statements of emotion and instead attempting to convey them in the action of the story, which again, we can talk about a little bit more when we get to the second part. So this is just, a statement about, Indian Camp and its status in American literature, as being one of those just remarkably compressed short stories. The characters are evoked with economy, et cetera. So, well, I don't want to give short shrift to Jhumpa Lahiri or to Oscar Caceres. But a couple things about them too to keep in mind for when we come back and talk about their stories too. Jhumpa Lahiri, she was, I think that her biography is particularly important for students to know, that she's the child of Bengalis who first immigrated from India to England before her birth, and then immigrated to the United States as well, settled in New England. Lahiri talks about traveling frequently to India in her family's attempt to keep connections with the rest of the family members who stayed there. It's also important that Lahiri is a literary scholar. She has a variety of degrees in English, and in comparative literature, and in creative writing, and even a PhD in Renaissance studies. And so all of these things tell us something about what Lahiri is attempting to do in her short stories. I think that it's interesting too that she has decided to move to Italy, and she started to write in Italian, actually, as well. So she's a very cosmopolitan writer. Here's a list of her books. Mrs. Sen's, the story that I shared with you, comes from Interpreter of Maladies, which won a Pulitzer Prize. Her first published book, she won a Pulitzer. Well-deserved, by the way. They're all good. All the stories in the collection are good, though Mrs. Sen's is my favorite. And then she wrote some novels as well. And then I wanted to share with you a representative critical response of her, talking about Jhumpa Lahiri not being an immigrant writer. And I'm not going to read this entire critical response, but this is a way to introduce students to Lahiri, to talk about the way there's this tension about how to categorize her. Is she an immigrant writer, or is she a regionalist, as this particular literary critic claims? And of course, then regionalism, I think, helps us to think a little bit about Oscar Casares. Also, this is his autobiography. The most important thing he decides that he needs to tell you when he's telling you who he is that he's from Brownsville, right? That's the first statement of his autobiography on his webpage, on his website. And then he tells you where it is, right? Located at the southern end of the Rio Grande River, just across the bridge from Matamoros, Mexico. And so, a regionalism is something that we'll return to a little bit again in part 2 of the webinar. But this is just a way, again, to frame a discussion of Oscar Casares. He also talks about living in Austin, which seems a world away from Brownsville, too, which is, as I think, really interesting to think about. And he talks about what he writes. With Casares, you have all kinds of opportunities to send your students on a mission to find more information about him. He's written a lot of articles, essays, newspaper opinion pieces. He's done a lot of interviews, that sort of thing. When I teach Casares, I have my students do this. I've read it all myself, but I have them find it. Right? I said, Google him, go to his website, follow the links, read the interviews, listen to the interviews, that sort of thing. Start collecting that information. Listen to what he says about himself. Listen to what he says about writing. Listen what he says about the borderlands. And bring that all back with you before we even start talking about his stories or his novels, one of his novels. And there's a definition of regionalism, which was at one time really the most popular mode in the United States, and still, I think, holds a really significant position in American literary studies. For your review later, I've given you a list of Texas short story writers and 10 teachable short stories. These are short stories that I've taught many times, and they almost never go wrong. And if you'd like, you can review them during the break, and we can talk about them for a couple of minutes when we come back. So that was a long introduction to teaching short stories. When we'll take, I don't know, take a 5-minute break, something like that, and then come back. I'll take your questions to start, and your comments too, and then we can talk a little bit about Indian Camp and Mrs. Sen's and Big Jesse, Little Jesse. So I think that what I'll do is tell you first what I was thinking about each one of the stories, and then I'll start with Indian Camp and just take a couple minutes to walk you through, one way you might approach teaching Indian Camp or really any story, right? So what I'm thinking is that for Indian Camp, I'll focus a little bit more on form, right? On the form of the short story with Jhumpa Lahiri, Mrs. Sens. I'll focus a little bit on immigration as what I think is the main focus of the story, specifically for the main character, Mrs. Sens. And then with, I keep wanting to call him Oscar because he's my colleague. I'm just going to start calling him Oscar, okay? So with Oscar, with Oscar's story, we'll talk a little bit about region and location, and what Oscar is trying to do representing this particular part of the United States, this particular part of Texas. So that's kind of the thinking, and the idea, of course, is that you can take form, or you can take a big context like immigration, or you can take a literary mode like regionalism, and you can take that approach to any story, right? And I think one of the things that as teachers we want to do is to try to choose the one that will get the students really invested in the story, the ones that will get them excited, the ones that will get them to read. I can't remember which one of you said something about having trouble getting students to read. I mean, it's just an ongoing problem. It really does seem more difficult to me than it did in the past. One thing, I didn't put this in the chat, but this is part of my response to that comment, is that I try to do more reading in class. And that's something that you can do. I mean, it's a lot easier with poetry, but you can do it with short stories, as well. So I don't, that's not ideal, and you can't do it with novels, right? But at least it's one thing you can do, particularly with pretty short stories like Indian Camp. So let me see if I'm able to share Indian Camp. Okay. So as I mentioned, does that look good? You can all see it, yes? Okay, great. So one of the things that I was thinking about Indian Camp, so I read these stories last night, and when I read Indian Camp, I noticed something that I'd never noticed before, which is either really awesome or really embarrassing, or maybe it's both, because I've taught this story probably 15 times, either in a short story class or in the Hemingway class. It was this context, I think, thinking about doing a webinar for Humanities Texas, and I was thinking about it just a little bit differently. And I noticed that Nick's nickname appears only one time in the story. I'd never noticed that before. And then I noticed that the word dad appears only once. So there's daddy 5 times and father 20 times, but the word dad only appears once. And I convinced myself, and I'm still convinced of it, that this is totally brilliant on Hemingway's part. Okay, so you'll remember that in the early manuscript for this story, there's about 5 paragraphs from the night before where Nick recognizes his own mortality. He's afraid of dying. And Hemingway cut all of that out, right? So that's gone. It also meant that Nick needed adult guidance, right? He was afraid. He needed his dad, or more specifically, he needed his daddy, right? Those are different words. They suggest slightly different things. He needed, you could say, to be Nicky, right? Which I think we'd agree, right? That this would be a name that a person named Nicholas or Nick would have when they were really young. And then at some point when they're 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 years old, they become Nick, right? A slightly more adult version of that name. And so I went back and counted the number of times that the names appear in the story, Nick, and then Nikki one time. I need to send this to you, actually. You don't have this version because I did it last night, now that I think about it. And then father, and then daddy and dad, and then, of course, Uncle George as well. And so I've never taught the story this way, never, but it's just another way to think about it. You could show your students this version with the names highlighted, and to ask them to think about, to analyze what Hemingway is doing with the names and how what he's doing with the names help us understand the central conflict in the story, which is Nick growing up and coming to a realization of his own mortality. Now, one thing in particular that I'm going to do the next time I teach Indie Camp is I'm going to focus on Uncle George, because if you follow Uncle George, which is a character I almost never talk about when I teach this story, but if you follow Uncle George, his character arc in this story is really interesting. If you just, I'm going to scroll through this and then I'm going to stop sharing screen too. But if you look, he's in a boat and he goes first by himself across the water. This is so mythological, crossing water, right? Crossing a river, that sort of thing. Hemingway knows this, of course. And then George is sitting there smoking a cigar by the time Nick and his father get there. Uncle George goes into the home of the native people that Nick's father is treating as their doctor. Okay, and then you just keep scrolling. I'm going to try not to go too fast because I don't want to give anyone vertigo. But Uncle George participates in what becomes a C-section. He's still helping. He's been bitten. His brother, Nick's dad, says, I'll put some peroxide on that. His dad, this is really important about Nick's dad, Dr. Adams, is full of adrenaline at this point. He's like really proud of himself for doing a cesarean section with a jackknife and sewing it up with fishing line. Uncle George says, oh, you're a great man, all right. You could spend 15 minutes with your students trying to figure out in what tone George says that. But if you look at everything that precedes that particular moment and how George is experiencing this, I think your students will be able to identify this as very thick sarcasm, right? George is upset by what's happened. He's really, really unhappy about how this has gone. So at the end of the story, where did Uncle George go? He'll turn up all right. George is the one who disappears. This is really a remarkable thing that Hemingway has done here, because it's about Nick growing up, entering an adult world, understanding about life and death, right? He's seen a birth and a death happen simultaneously in the story. And it's his uncle, one of the adult men, who's really traumatized by what happened. Whereas Nick has repressed everything and decided that he is quite sure that he would never die. So I'll stop sharing for a moment and see if you have any comments or questions about that. Again, I wanted to focus on this in particular because I've never thought about the story quite in this particular way. There are all kinds of other ways to think about it, particularly if you're teaching the whole collection of In Our Time. because it's the introduction to Nick Adams, who appears in about 6 or 7 of the stories, too. So this approach, I mean, this is really close reading of the form of the short story, right? You don't necessarily have to, have those photographs of Hemingway standing by a lake that I had in my PowerPoint presentation. That was Hemingway as a kid at the family cabin in Michigan, including one where he's standing next to a boat. I meant that to evoke this story. But you don't necessarily need to know those things or need to know the story about Hemingway and Agnes von Kurowski to talk about what Hemingway is trying to accomplish within this story. And just thinking about the character names, you could even do it with the pronouns as well. I don't know if this would be the most terribly exciting approach for your students or even for mine, but I'm going to try it. I'm going to try it and ask them to think about what's happening, particularly when Nick becomes Nicky and Dad becomes Daddy, right? Like try to get them to focus on that in particular. So any thoughts or comments? April is saying, let's see, names, the crucible, right? Students get more insight on how names are important, right? The nuance of language. Great, thank you for that too, April. April, actually, that comment makes me think about an activity that I used to do with my students. It's a variation of the one I shared with you at the beginning of part 1 of today's webinar. I would ask them to tell me the story of their full name, or to tell the class the story of their full name, right? It's just a variation on that. Our stories have names. Our first name, our middle name, or our multiple middle names, or our middle initial, and our family surname, as well. And I often paired it, with pieces of literature that were about names, right? So if I'm remembering correctly, it's in House on Mango Street, Sandra Cisneros. There's a chapter called My Name, right? This is where I think, if I'm remembering correctly, Esperanza wants to change her name to Zizi the X. Is this right? Some of you are shaking your head. Oh my God, I can't believe I remembered that. Okay, thank you for confirming. So I would teach that and talk about a short story, right? Like you could just read that in class, and say, look, here's a young girl thinking about her name and what it says about her. And she's not loving it, even though her name's Esperanza, but she's not loving it and she wants to change it. If you do that and have them do the writing about their name, if you had classroom time to do this, 3 or 4 of your students are going to say, I don't like my name. I wanted to change it. Here's what I wanted to change it to. Or like my younger sister, who wanted to, was tired of people calling her Bets. So her name's Betsy. So she wanted to change her name because she was so tired of people making it sound like, she was in a poker game or something, right? So anyway, April, thank you for that. Other comments or thoughts before I shift to Jhumpa Lahiri's Mrs. Sens. Or questions about how else you might approach Indian camp too.
I was just gonna jump in and say, if you want to speak directly and unmute, that's welcome too. You don't have to type things into the chat. It's just whatever your preference is for questions.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah. I'll say one other thing then too. As Laura told you all in her introduction, her very kind introduction, I teach Native American literature. That's my real specialty. And Hemingway's early short stories often have indigenous characters. So one of the approaches that I take to Indian camp is just to talk about the history of the representation of Native Americans in American literature by non-Native authors. And there's some really uncomfortable, problematic things going on in Indian camp And, it's something that I feel it's really important to talk about with my students too. The one thing about those kinds of stereotypes is that your students know them, right? I mean, they know what the stereotypes are. They can identify them immediately. And so that's another approach to Indian camp. And then we read the other stories in which Nick, as an older boy, then as a young man, he goes back to the camp as well, and you can kind of trace his interaction with that community. There was a historical one too, of course, near the Hemingway family's cabin in Upper Michigan. So too, that can be really tricky. It's tricky for me. I imagine it might even be more trickier for you all, too, to talk about those things. But I try to prepare my students beforehand. It's like, there's some things in this story that you're going to have a very strong negative reaction to. We're going to talk about them, as well. So, Melissa says, I would love a list of Native American literature you like to teach. I'm always trying to give my students a variety of voices. That would be great. You know what? I can do that. I probably have one somewhere on my computer, and I can send it to Elizabeth and Laura afterwards, and they can share it. They can share it with you all. I was trying to think of a Sherman Alexie short story to include on that particular list, because I teach him quite a bit. But I bet a lot of you have read Alexie, and he's always pushing buttons. And so I'm always uncertain about whether or not one of his short stories would appear on a high school syllabus or not. The one that I teach all the time is Dear John Wayne, which I just think is an all-time great short story. I did include one short story by a Native writer on that list of teachable short stories, Thomas King's Tidings of Comfort and Joy. So that's one that I think is pretty readily available. And if it's not, I could probably find a copy of it and also forward it to Elizabeth and Laura to share with you. So as you might imagine, almost anything that you teach by a Native author is really difficult. It's just like, it's sort of automatically difficult. There's some really, really beautiful short stories, but your students will have a lot of feelings about them, right? For example, Leslie Marmon Silko's Lullaby, beautiful short story, but it's hard. So anyway, that's one that I was thinking about. It takes a lot more preparation, it seems to me, to teach Native literature. That's a great, Gina's comment there. It's such a great question. I've not read the text. Do any of the Native American characters speak at all? And if not, good question to ask. Why are they voiceless? Also, if they do, what are the characters supporting characteristically about a stereotype? These are great questions. Those you could, have asked that question of your students. And also, I've taught this story so many times and can't remember if any of them speak. It probably means they didn't. But I don't think so. Though it's one of those questions where I would hate to be wrong. So I'd like go read it again and just make 100% sure that that's not the case. But that's such a good comment. They are a voiceless, even if they say one or two things, right, in really short comments or something like that, they are a voiceless background in the story. They are the background. In fact, this is really interesting for Ernest Hemingway's career. They occupy the same position narratively as a lot of other populations that he encounters in his writing career. So if you read anything that he writes about being on safari in Africa, it's the same thing with indigenous Africans. If you read The Sun Also Rises, it's very similar with the Basques and the Romanis in that story. Right now, they some of them do speak in The Sun Also Rises, but still they are serving as the background, right? Not as the foreground, not as round characters, to go back to our vocabulary list. Okay.
But that's a good conversation to have about the title, because it's Indian camp, but the
Mhm.
Indians or Native Americans don't.
Mhm.
They don't really occupy that space. The narrator is, right? So it's
Right.
very interesting.
It is really interesting. Yeah, it really is. And I mean, students are capable of talking about this, right? I mean, they at least in my experience, right? They see these things happening and they understand. I think what authors are doing when they present a setup like this, right? Where there's Dr. Adams, Uncle George, and Nick crossing the water to what is essentially an exotic world for them, right? It is I put this in quotes, an other world, right? And this is such a typical narrative structure in what we'd say the Western or the European and European American world, right? That the coming of age occurs in an interaction with some kind of exotic, other, different world, right? So this is, in other words, Hemingway is this extraordinary stylist, and what he's doing in this story is actually really experimental. It probably doesn't look like that anymore, but it was really experimental, and the narrative couldn't be more conventional. The narrative is so, and I don't really mean that as a judgment. It's an observation, right? We've read Indian Camp hundreds of times, just in different versions. And those patterns, by the way, are something that I think students really like to hear us talk about, right? They see like, where else do you see this happening? You see it in all kinds of adventure tales, for example. And in other short stories by really prominent American writers. You can just shift over to Faulkner and look at some of his stories with Native American characters, and the same thing is happening right here. So, okay. Oh, okay. Anna Maria says, how would you address the apparent apathy Nick's father has for his female patient? I do have an answer to that, though I'm curious how you would address it. And if you don't want to share, I'll tell you what I think, but that makes me curious what you're thinking. I don't see you on my screen
Oh,
either.
sorry,
Oh, there you are.
my camera's having troubles, but I was thinking about it because it bothers me. Like the dad is just such one of those old school doctors. Like, and that's part of one way to address it is that kind of godlike mentality you could have towards doctors during that time. But it just bugs me when he's like, oh, her pain doesn't matter and all this. And I'm like, but I was like, okay, well, if this is to like, I think it's, what does that teach Nick about what his father does and how his father treats people? Because you can emphasize the difference between how his father treats Nick and how his father treats somebody else. And then how the view, like, it's also kind of Nick's hero worship of his dad. So I think that might have to be one approach, is really emphasizing that it's how Nick views his father and that level of kind of like, how do we tend to view our parents? Because otherwise, like, I mean, Nick's dad comes off like as a horrible person. So that's the issue I was really having, because that's the problem I have with Hemingway a lot of the time is how he approaches like female characters, how he approaches that thing. So I was really kind of struggling, and then I had to work through it a little bit.
Right. Yes, all great questions and great comments. That's the kind of moment where, I mean, I know what I think, and so I like to hear how the students are responding to that. My students tend to respond the same way you do. They see Dr. Adams not just in a negative light, but as a really awful person. Right? There's just like, he has the worst bedside manner that you can imagine. I think that one of the keys to reading Dr. Adams, who just in the other stories in which he appears, he's the same way. He is withdrawn. He is he's not interested in other people's feelings. In fact, he's not interested in feelings at all, really. So Hemingway represents him as a really repressed character, but it also makes him a brutal person. I mean, what he does to the Native woman in this story is brutality. I mean, it's just, he does it. He didn't come, he's a doctor, and he didn't come prepared for an emergency. So he has to use his fishing gear to do a cesarean section. And then after he does the cesarean section, he's stoked because for him, it's like winning a football game or something, right? And it's just like, it's the kind of thing that the more you think about it, the more awful it really is. Partly what I'm saying, Anna Maria, is that I agree with you. I suspect a lot of your students would as well, but it's also what's crucial, two things. One, what you said, what does this teach Nick, right? Like that's really, really crucial, because Hemingway is very interested in the development of a particular kind of masculinity. And if this is the start of it, so masculinity for Nick at 6, 7, 8 years old is doing a cesarean section on an indigenous woman with a jackknife and fishing line. Okay, so there's a critique there built into that. And Uncle George is our line into that particular critique of it. So that's what I would talk about a little bit. I'd follow up on what you were thinking about what this is teaching Nick and how really awful the lesson is for Nick, and what this means for, he's a kid, right? So he sees this at 7 or 8 years old, or however old he is in the story. But then there's also Uncle George's response. So Uncle George doesn't like any of this. He doesn't want to have anything to do with it. So what would it mean then for Nick to have gone to his Uncle George instead of his father, Dr. Adams, to learn whatever lesson there was to learn, from this? So yeah, I'll stop there. Let's go, before we get any further, let's go to Lahiri for a moment. Let me see if I'm able to share this screen. Okay. All good? Okay, thanks, Laura. You were very quick with the thumbs up there. Thank you. Okay, so Mrs. Sens is a story that appears in Interpreter of Maladies. That's the 1999 collection that won the Pulitzer Prize, Lahiri's first published book. And I shared with you the thoughts of that one reviewer who was very insistent that Jhumpa Lahiri is not an immigrant writer, but instead is a New England regionalist. That's how that reviewer thinks of Lahiri. And I apologize that I can't remember the name of the person who did this, but someone asked about, sharing criticism with students and when's a good time, to do that. I think of book reviews as criticism. And I find book reviews really, really valuable when you're teaching an author, because they tend to be very short. It's additional reading, but it's not onerous. And so often, when I'm teaching Lahiri, even in an introductory course, I'll have them read a review or two, or have them track one down themselves and read it and share what they learned about the class. It gives the students an entry into the conversation, right? They can, in other words, in the most basic sense, agree or disagree with the reviewer, right? And so, my sense of that reviewer, is that, they are focusing, more on wanting to insist on Lahiri's place in American literature, and in particular in that very privileged component of American literature that has as its center New England, too. So at the same time, I think it would be a very, very difficult argument to make that Jhumpa Lahiri is not an immigrant writer, since she is an immigrant, and she writes about immigrants almost exclusively. So even in her novels, but still, I think it's a way to, introduce students to how other people who love literature talk about it. In this case, with book reviewers, not teachers, really, or not literary scholars, but avid readers who love literature and care about it. And even if you disagree with this particular reviewer, we can respect their opinion, their perspective on Mrs. Sen's. But with on Jubal Lahiri, I mean, since the reviewer wasn't talking specifically about Mrs. Sen's. But so for this story, then I was thinking about it specifically as a story about immigration. It's one students tend to really love. If you didn't have the chance to read it, it's about a young kid, Elliot, who has a single working mother who, wants Elliot to have some adult supervision. They burn through a couple babysitters and end up with Mrs. Sen as Elliot's babysitter. And Mrs. Sen, this is the central conflict of the story, doesn't know how to drive. So Elliot's mom is concerned that if there's an emergency, how is Mrs. Sen going to get Elliot to the doctor or to the hospital or wherever he wants to go? So what I did with this one when I was reading it last night is I just went through and pointed to the passages where Lahiri mentions the driving. I didn't highlight all of it because there's quite a bit of it in the story, but we learn right on the first page that Mrs. Sen did not know how to drive. Most of all, she, Elliot's mother, was concerned that Mrs. Sen did not know how to drive. Mr. Sen, who is a professor at the local university, has been giving her lessons, and Mrs. Sen says, "At home, we have a driver." And there's a moment later in the story where Elliot realizes when Mrs. Sen says home, she means India. She doesn't mean this place. And so you kind of scroll through the story. Again, I want to go slow so as not to give you vertigo. Mrs. Sen practices driving with Elliot. Lahiri finds it irresistible not to give you a sense of the time period where the story is set by talking about the AM radio with chrome buttons. So she gives us a little bit of that. And we see a little bit of Mrs. Sen's anxiety when it comes to learning how to drive. You can kind of scroll through here a little bit more. There's not much about driving. There's a lot about Mrs. Sen remaining in contact with her family and feeling isolated because Mr. Sen has a job. His social world is at the university. She's at home by herself. So this story is in many ways very much about the gendered experience of immigration and how it's different for men and women. And in this case, at least, maybe in lots of cases, it's a lot easier for the man, who in this case, at least has a position, has a job. They immigrated because of his job. And his wife is at home. Mrs. Sen is at home. And then the conflict continues. Mrs. Sen decides not to drive. We learn later it's because someone in her family has died, her grandfather. So you notice here that Lahiri is now working to connect the driving to the immigration experience. And then Mr. Sen insists that he drives. It does not go well. We're told, I hate driving, I won't go on. And then she stops driving. And then near the end of the story, she does make an attempt to drive by herself. And as Lahiri tells us here, right almost on the last page of the story, the accident occurred quickly. So what I've done with the highlighting then, I'm going to stop sharing. What I've done with the highlighting then, is point to the way that Lahiri has taken the experience of immigration and presented it to us through what I think you could argue is a very American culture of driving. There's also a lot going on in this story with The Great Gatsby, which in a lot of ways is about the American experience and driving and having accidents as well. various automobile accidents in Gatsby. And there's the scene in Gatsby where they're throwing all the colorful shirts around. And in this story, at one point, Mrs. Sen throws her really colorful saris around and says, I don't have anywhere that I can wear these while I'm here, because she never leaves the apartment. So there's, even if your students haven't read The Great Gatsby, you could show them clips from the Leonardo DiCaprio Gatsby adaptation. And right, you could show them the car accident, or you could show them the scene with the shirts, right? Like that sort of thing, and talk about the way that Lahiri is writing the experience of immigration to the US into a Gatsby story, which is very much about an outsider, Gatsby, right? Trying to make a space for himself in the affluent world, of New York. So in any case, what I'm saying is that if you approach this just directly as a story about immigration, you focus on the driving itself. And since driving is such a part, it seems to me, of American life, we all get in the car every day and hate it. I mean, maybe that's not true. I shouldn't put it that way. I'll just speak for myself, right? Actually, I'm at home today, so I didn't get in the car, so it was a good day. But in any case, you can, even just by doing what I did, which was just by looking at the parts of the story that are about driving, you can see the really, really clever, careful way that Lahiri has condensed the experience of immigration into the experience of trying to learn how to drive. So you can start substituting words and phrases. When she says, I hate driving, what is she really saying? You see what I mean? Yeah, I saw Gina smile, right? Yeah, is it the driving that she hates? Well, yes, but there's a lot behind that as well. You know what she really hates? Being apart from her family. That's what she hates. She hates that her grandfather died while she couldn't go back. Those are the kind, she at one point, she's preparing a meal and she talks about how at home all of the women would sit together and make the meal. So she misses the women's community at home, as well. And this is, again, I think that, this is an approach that works very well for students, high school and college students too, right? Where you can get them, to talk about the aspects of her life in India that she doesn't want to give up. Mr. Sen does, he's okay with it, right? But there's this really, really, really deep tension and conflict in the marriage that's the result of immigration, and it plays out in the story primarily through driving. So when Mr. Sen says, you're going to drive today, it's not too much of a stretch to say that, in fact, he's saying you're going to be an American today, right? Like that's sort of the end game for this way of talking about the story. And I'd never say that to my students up front, but if you have a 45-minute class, that's where you kind of hope to end, right? Where you say, well, what is right? And then of course, there are all kinds of ways to get students to talk about their personal experiences with driving and what it means to them and what it meant to get their driver's license and those kinds of things. I'm thinking back to one of you who mentioned RG, and you said that your students, the one of Oscar's stories in Brownsville mentioned RG and the really powerful personal connection that your students had to it. You said that your students said, that's my father, right? And then I followed up with a comment saying I had that same experience with Who's Irish by Gish Jen, and I had a student crying in class because they were so happy to have seen their Chinese grandmother represented in literature and represented in a real way, right? This is a class with 300 students, and he had this incredibly powerful reaction. Now, I don't mean you're going to get that same kind of reaction to Mrs. Sen's, but right, there are ways, I think, to get students to talk about the culture of driving and the culture of automobiles and how it relates to individualism and, quote, self-reliance and those kinds of things and what it means culturally, as a way to think about what Jhumpa Lahiri is saying about assimilation and acculturation, and specifically Mrs. Sen's resistance to it. Okay, I've talked a lot. I'm going to stop. Let's see if there are any questions. Like Elizabeth was saying, you're welcome to unmute and comment if you'd like, or ask questions. I've completely lost track of the chat. I apologize.
I'd like to make a comment in
Yes.
regard to what you were saying. I really like how you brought up the cultural studies approach towards this story in regards to the driving, because what I tend to sometimes see with stories that involve immigrants or is that if it's oftentimes flattened to just it's an immigrant story or it's an American dream story. And I think it takes time to unpack those cultural aspects of it. I mean, it really does. So I want to just thank you for agree with you on that and bringing that. It takes time. So don't rush through these short stories. So.
Right. Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it can be really tricky, I think. We're in a room full of teachers, so you all know this, but I feel like sometimes it's worth saying out loud, that it can be really tricky to figure out what we want to tell students and what we want them to arrive at on their own, right? And so when it comes to, I'm thinking about that in particular with what you said, Michelle. When I teach Mrs. Sens, there's certain things that I'm really, really anxious for the students to see, but I don't tell them. I don't come into class and write the 5 things I want you to hear about. I want it to feel more organic, which is why the conversation about the short stories is so important. And you're so right too. It takes time, it really takes time to get there. I actually think it's possible that there are a few of you in the room thinking right now, but we don't have enough time, right? I mean, it's always about the time, that you're allowed to devote to certain things that you're teaching. But I actually I've over the years I've come to the conclusion that it's okay to teach fewer works if you're able to do what Michelle is talking about. Like it's okay, right? Coverage, what we used to call coverage, it's a windmill. Don't tilt at it, right? I mean, because if you can teach a student to read one short story like Mrs. Sens, you can teach them to read anything, right? So that in the end, the patience. And this is something I'm really bad at. I'm one of the most impatient people. I might be the most impatient person I know. It takes patience, right? You just have to slow down, let students go off on different paths, right? Like try to figure out what it means to them. Even thinking about RG or Big Jessie, Little Jessie too, it's the same kind of thing. And when they do have that personal connection, to get them to really, really think about it. Right? How did the author evoke that, for you? And what does that mean for you, right now that you've seen into this world, or seen your own world represented, in such a powerful way? So, okay. Well, you know what? I think that I'd like to say a couple of things about Big Jessie, Little Jessie too, even though I'm a little bit self-conscious of the time. So let me share the screen one more time. And it's okay. I'm going to tell Oscar that this happened, that we didn't quite spend as much time with his story as I wanted to. And we'll just hope that he's really charitable and generous in his response. We will see. Okay. So let me try to get. Thank you, Laura. Okay, great. All right. So as I mentioned, in part 1 of the webinar, I think that Oscar's collection, Brownsville, and each of the individual short stories in it lends itself just really, really nicely to talking about place and region and regionalism. And I always keep in mind what Oscar says when he talks about Brownsville. He always says that he doesn't think of himself as a minority writer. These are his words, right? He says, because in Brownsville, my people are the majority. He's like, I'm not a minority writer. Like, this is the world. And I think that's actually something that I do share with students before we ever start talking about his stories, right? I say, this is really, really important to remember, right? That this is a place that for Oscar, he grew up there, with all his siblings and his parents, and his dad worked along the border. He said, it wasn't until he left Austin, actually, they thought, oh, right, I'm actually not in the majority everywhere I go, right? But I am in Brownsville. And again, it feels a little bit like I'm stating the obvious. After all, the short story collection is called Brownsville too. So he wants us to think about that. And so I did something similar with this copy of Brownsville, which is dedicated to his parents as well. Is I kind of went through and looked for the way in Big Jesse, Little Jesse, that he conveys to us that we're in Brownsville, or at least that we're in South Texas. And there aren't as many as I remembered, actually. But part of that has to do with the fact I often teach the whole collection, right? And so once if you're ever fortunate enough to teach an entire short story collection, you can start to read the later ones with and against the previous ones, right? Because they've all been carefully arranged in a particular way to tell a broader arc. At least that's the way I think of short story collections. They're not novels, and I don't treat them like novels, but authors do move us through a world that they've thought about very carefully. So look, I haven't highlighted anything yet, right? I'm like, well, this story's about Brownsville, right? Oh, right, here we go. So finally, halfway through the story, we learn a little bit about Corina's family, which is, as our narrator, as Oscar puts it, two of her brothers are, Corina's family is made up of people who get married and stay married. This, of course, is the central conflict of Big Jesse, Little Jesse, that Jesse and Corina are divorced. Another brother is a dentist who lives and works with his wife in Houston. Corina and her sister are the only ones who stayed in Brownsville. Gloria married an older man who's a customs supervisor at the bridge. So Oscar here is evoking a pretty specific place. Of course, there are other border towns with bridges too, right? But he tells us this is Brownsville. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. And then there's not a lot more, actually. I'm going to keep scrolling through it. He mentions the Herald and El Bravo, Brownsville periodicals. He mentions sitting at a table at, this is Reina's Cafe. He's got a group of Border Patrol agents there with their walkie-talkies. He also mentions 4 businessmen, which I actually highlighted, because, the border region is a place of just constant economic activity, right? Like these are, they're just, businesses on one or the other or both sides of the border, right? Working both north and south, big businesses trading between the two countries. It's a really significant component of the identity of that region as well. So I highlighted 4 businessmen too, and not just the Border Patrol agents, as well. And I think that is the last reference. Oh, I did highlight Lucha Libre and Mil Mascaras just because I like those references, at the end. And it would be important, I think, for your students to know if they don't already, what Oscar is making reference to in those passages. But I think that, that what's interesting, if you're just teaching Big Jesse, Little Jesse, you can actually take those. You can convey to your students that the entire collection is about Brownsville. Emphasize to them that it was really important to Oscar that you see these characters living in Brownsville. So important that even in a story where it's not necessary for him to tell you that they're in Brownsville, he still goes ahead and tells you, oh, by the way, right, Corina decided to stay in Brownsville. So she chose to stay there. So there's this really interesting commentary on all kinds of things about life in Brownsville, including this familial diaspora, right? Where you might have a bunch of siblings and some of them decide to go, well, where do? You go to Houston or you go to San Antonio. In my home state of Illinois, I live downstate. That's everything that's not Chicago. Where does my family go? They go to Chicago, right? Like that's the place where people go. If they want to, like change the trajectory of their life or try something new or live in the big city. And so there's that diaspora part of it. And then, and this is the last thing I say about Oscar's story, because I think that we do need to wrap up. But the intersection of class and race in the story is so interesting. And Oscar is trying to evoke something about Brownsville when he's talking about this and the different class identities of Big Jesse and Corrina, and also how that plays out at the carnival in the final story. And so what I would ask my students to think about, if we're approaching this as a story that's a regionalist story, right? A story about a region, about a very specific place, is I would ask them to think about that intersection, right? And what it tells us about Brownsville, and the impact that it has on this particular family. And of course, as you can tell from the stories I selected, I love teaching stories that are about families, right? So in Indian camp, we have a father, an uncle, and a son. In Mrs. Sen's, we have a mother, a son, and a babysitter, right? And in Big Jesse, Little Jesse, we have a father, a son, and an estranged spouse, as well. So so I think that the short stories, I make that point because I think if the short stories that you choose have recurrent patterns, it makes it a little bit easier to teach. Particularly, and now I'm going back to what Michelle was saying about 10 minutes ago too, particularly if you're patient and the students come to that conclusion themselves, right? So you get to Big Jesse, Little Jesse, and someone says, wait, this is the third 10-year-old boy that we've encountered this semester. What's going on with that, right? And they know, you can do this with any, that just happened to be the stories I chose for today, right? But in any case, it can be really, really helpful for your students to be able to read stories with and against each other, too, whether they're by the same author or not.